Well, welcome to my final resting place. My name is Mrs. Ellen Frances Burpee Farr. Now, have any of you ever heard of me before?
Far Hill.
Far Hill, yes, indeed. Well, Far Hill is named after my husband's family. But do you actually know me? But you've heard the name. Excellent, excellent. Well, I was actually not born, nor did I die here in Littleton, but yet here I am buried. In my day, as you may imagine, a woman... Oh, the wind keeps wanting to knock down my pictures. Let's put this back. I'll tell you about this in a minute. In my day, a woman belonged to her husband's family once she got married, and so it was with me. So even though I was educated at the New Hampton Institute as a young girl during my primary schooling, and then I went on to Thetford Academy in Thetford, Vermont for my secondary education. And did you know that Thetford Academy is actually the oldest school running in Vermont for secondary education? It is, and I went there. And that is where I met my dear Everett Farr. We were in school together. What do you call that? You have a name for this. School sweethearts, I think you call it. So we were in love, and at the age of 18, we didn't get engaged until I was 19. But at the age of 18, I went back to New Hampton Institute so that I could teach drawing to the other students who had followed after I had left. But at the age of 19, my Everetts and I became engaged. And we had planned a lovely ceremony with many people coming and so forth and so on. But unfortunately, an event of some significance happened in the early 1860s. Does anyone happen to know what that is? The Civil War. Thank you. The Civil War breaks out. So even though we had plans to get married later, do you think we got married later or sooner? Sooner, needless to say. So we got married in Portsmouth, and just a few days afterwards, my husband, who had enlisted first, by the way, in Littleton, when President Lincoln asked for volunteers, he went off to fight the war and was injured in the Battle of Williamsburg and lost his right arm. But needless to say, he was a very heroic and courageous soldier in battle. And so they sent him home to recover from his injuries, which worked out very well for us. For 9 months later, my first child was born, my lovely Ida, of whom we still have descendants here in the audience today. The other group saw you, but this group has not met you yet. This is my dear great-great-granddaughter, Susan Luca, who is also an artist. Correct? So I shall tell them more about you in a minute. She's here with her, I'll tell you now, she's here with her family, but I think they left you behind, my dear. They did. So, I'm enjoying this. Excellent. Well, you can stay and just sit with me. That works. That's fine with me. So, anyway, as I was saying, so the Civil War breaks out. Oh, goodness. Would you do me the great honor of holding my picture? Thank you so much, my dear. Both of them. I don't want to keep fighting with the wind. So, so the Civil War breaks out, and in between, oh, goodness, yes, we don't want to lose that. By the way, that's my napkin ring that my descendants continue to preserve as an heirloom, and it has my initials, Ellen Frances Burpee Farr. So the Civil War breaks out, and my husband keeps coming and going, and in the meantime, a son is born to us, Herbert Augustus Farr. And then at some point, finally, the Civil War ends. My husband is promoted to Major Farr, by the way. Then he comes back to Littleton and is able to continue his studies, for he had started the study of law at Dartmouth College before the war broke out. But he had to suspend his studies to be able to go and fight the war. So he continued, and in 1867, he achieved the bar exam and started practicing law in Lancaster. And he had a successful law practice, and being very well known for his courage and heroism, and being very well trusted by the locals of this area, he began to be involved in politics, and actually ran for office and was elected. In fact, he was elected against a very popular Democrat. I'm not going to be factious today, but my husband was a staunch Republican and very proud. And he won office and continued to win other posts until he was elected to the 46th Congress of the United States as a representative from New Hampshire. So we went to Washington, and there we met many illustrious people of the day and spent some time meeting and greeting. And of course, he was known as a man of few words, but the words that he did use mattered. And so we lived in Washington and came back here during the breaks, and he was elected to a second term in office. But sadly, at that point, he became ill and caught pneumonia and died many, many years before his time here in Littleton. And he died November 30th, 1880, and was buried here in early December. And here he remains with, by the way, the remains of my daughter Edith, my third child, who died at 18 of ovarian cancer, very young, also before her time. But anyway, at the time that we buried him, myself and my 3 children were still living, and so I thought, what am I going to do? How can I go on? My husband, who was everything to me, is now gone. I think maybe I'll go back to the study of drawing, and I'll try to see what happens if I practice my art and try to find work as an artist. And so I took my family to Boston. And there I set up a studio and actually learned under some very renowned artists at the time. Monsieur Guillaume taught me. He was a very well-known landscape and very realistic painter of the day. And there I kept my studio up until my daughter Ida married, and her husband Edwin Miller of piano fame. She married and had children of her own, and my youngest Edith was still 14, 15 years old, and she was better off with my daughter being a society lady and having much more opportunity to meet people there. So I left her there and went west to California, to Pasadena. And there I set up shop. Many of us, I think you also have a saying here, snowbirds? Well, back in my day, we went west. We didn't go south. The south would have been unbearable. Oof, very, very hot. In my day. I think now you have things that cool the air and such. But in my day, we went to California. And so Pasadena was the place to be. And I set up a studio in one of the very renowned hotels there, where other people from Boston and who knew of me and my family, and of course my husband having been a congressman, we knew many illustrious people who went west for the winter. And there I sold my paintings to them. Paintings such as the pepper painting that my dear great-granddaughter has here. Those are some of my favorite themes, pepper trees as well as Indian baskets and such. Those are some of the favorite things that I painted. And to the point where I actually became better known in California than I think I am here. For I am in many books. Imagine that. Me, in Independent Spirits, American Review, Art Review, and other such illustrious journals that have documented the art that I did. Oh, did I tell you? I even exhibited in the 1893 Chicago World Fair and Exposition. Myself and other California painters did. That was such a wonderful time in my life. I remember those days quite vividly. So, I was in California, and I'm painting and I'm enjoying myself, and I become active in many civic organizations. I found the Young Women's League, which was meant to promote women in business and establish entrepreneurial spirit. I also was a founding member of the Shakespeare Club in Pasadena, and I was also a member of the Order of the Eastern Star and the Daughters of the American Revolution. I was a very, very busy lady. How I found time to paint so much, I still don't even know, but I did. And so at some point I started thinking of what you call a bucket list. I had always wanted to travel to Europe. I had always wanted to go and visit the great museums of the world and see the lovely paintings and monuments of the great European artists. And so I traveled in 1906, it was about June, I decided I was going to do it. So I packed up my belongings, settled my affairs, and set out for a 2-year tour around the world. And I made it to my daughter Ida's home in Boston, where I spent the summer with the intention of progressing on to Europe. However, I fell ill with something called gastric fever. Does anyone know what gastric fever is? Has anyone heard of this? Have you heard of typhoid Mary?
Oh, yes.
Yes, that's what I got, typhoid fever. But I was able to recover. I was very ill for a time, but I was able to make a recovery. But the doctors weren't very pleased. I lost a lot of weight, and they said I really oughtn't to travel. But I said, no, I am going to do this. I have always wanted to do this, and come hell or high water, I am doing it. And so I did. On November 1906, I set off across the ocean to Italy, where I landed in and stayed some weeks in Naples, until sadly my old malady possibly returning to me, or some other illness for which I had already become vulnerable, having been very ill the summer before, was my demise. and I died on January 5th, 1907. Now, in the meantime, my daughter, who's the only surviving descendant at this point, for my son Herbert had died a few years earlier. He worked as a cab driver in Boston, which was a hazardous occupation, as you might imagine, back then. More so than it is today, perhaps. And so my daughter Ida went to great extents to bring my body back so that I could be buried here in Littleton, where you see me here with the gravestone of my husband and my other child. For the Italian sailors were very superstitious. They did not want to travel with a body aboard the ship. And so my family had to come up with the idea of packing me very well in a box and labeling it statuary so that I could be brought back. And actually I came back on the very same ship that took me to Europe 5 weeks later. And then here I lie with my husband and my lovely daughter Edith in the family plot in Gledwood Cemetery.
Good afternoon, and welcome. It's so good of you to come out on a day like today to visit the dead. We don't get too many visitors, and most of the time we're it's kind of like Australia. We're down under. I placed my jacket here because I like to keep my area clean, because this is my gravestone, and you don't know how cold it is down there. So any little bit of warmness I will take and cover up. I forgot who I am. I am Cephas Brackett, right here, and I was born in 1816 and I died in 1899. Those were good years, absolutely wonderful. 83 years old. Now, in the time period, I knew a lot of people who didn't make it past 20 due to dyspepsia and anything else that would knock you out, and it did. A lot of people died young, and you either died young or you made it to my age, and then died anyway. All right, so there's one thing, it just catches you both ways. As I said, Cephas Brackett, 1816. Now, I made my money in the stagecoach business. I ran the stagecoaches, and it was rather interesting. It was great, as I remember. When I was 17 years old, I earned a seat on a stagecoach from Littleton to Haverhill. And getting a seat on it doesn't mean you buy a ticket, open a door, and sit down and wait for a movie. That's not getting a seat. But getting the seat is I worked on it. And I would sit, there were benches in the back on the top, and I would sit there. And I'll tell you, on rainy nights, cold, snowy nights, it was miserable. But as 17, we know teenagers, right? No brain, no pain. So it was the same. It was an adventure to do this, to go out and do this. So my job was to help the ladies get into the carriage, into the stagecoach, and also to take their luggage. Now, in those years, when I was younger, people did not go away for a 3-day weekend. They went away for a month. They went away for 2 months. So when they would come up here to vacation, they came up for extended periods of time. So I used to haul trunks that were loaded with clothing. So a lady from Boston or New York would come up with 2 steamer trunks packed. Because back then, you dressed properly. You dressed for breakfast, you dressed for dinner, you dressed for lunch, you dressed for tea. So you changed, people back then spent most of their time changing their clothing. I don't know how they accomplished much. But they did wear out a lot of pairs of pants, I guess. So I started off on the stagecoach run. I later, as I became older, I later purchased the stage route from Haverhill to Littleton. And it was quite lucrative. It was quite lucrative. We used to bring the mail, and the government back then didn't really give much thought of how it spent money. I don't know how it is today. But it gave very little. The money was there and they spent it. The mail route brought in $3,500 a year. $3,500 a year for me. All right? And that not only counted that I had passengers inside the coach. Now, going from Littleton down to Haverhill, I mean, it was nothing. It was just a jaunt. I mean, you get in, and 4 hours later, you're in Haverhill. All right? And because the horse, with a team of horses, you can get a horse going at a good clip of 20 miles an hour. But when it was hauling a stagecoach, it slowed down a little. And if I did push the animals too fast, when I got to the end, we ended up with a carriage full of people and a pile of dead horses. So I took care of my animals because they were expensive to replace. Later on, I picked up the route from Littleton to Plymouth. Now, in the 1840s, people didn't come up here through Franconia Notch. They would call, instead of saying we're going on vacation, they would say we're mountaining. We're mountaining. So the mountaineers would take coaches from Boston to Nashua, to Manchester, to Concord, and they would hop coaches, and this is approximately a 3.5-day trip to come up here back then. And so they would mountain. Now, in the Notch, there was a place called the Profile House, which did not exist in this time period. It existed more toward the time of my death. Okay, I remember hearing about incredible building. Understand it burnt after I died, which means I had nothing to do with it. But what had happened is there was an inn, a tavern that was built on the spot where they later built the Profile House. And it was those crafty Canadians. There was rumor that the Canadians used it for smuggling. What they smuggled, we don't know. Bears, I don't know. Okay? But they used it for smuggling. And it would become a smuggler's den. And I think that probably added to the ambiance of the long trip up here by stagecoach. And one does not know what the passengers were up to either in this hellhole of iniquity as we look at it. All right? I picked that up from a Mr. Barnes, that route. What had happened is, when you're doing a stage run, you have to mind your teams. And we would have anywhere from 4 to 6 horses, anywhere from 2 to 4 teams. Sometimes we would have up to 8 horses. All right? And what had happened is he was taking a stage run, and the lead horses became spooked and went over an embankment and took everyone with them down the embankment. Now, you have to remember, Mr. Barnes was sitting on the top of the stagecoach, which was probably not the best vantage point as you're going over a cliff. All right? It went over the embankment. He was severely injured, did not die, but he would probably wished he did, but he was severely injured, and the passengers in the coach were injured. He then sold the route to me, because as we all know, with youth comes stupidity, so we move onward. Now, as time moved on, I decided to get out of the stagecoach, the coaching business. Oh, except I did have a route from Littleton to Mount Washington. Okay, not what you understand as the hotel. Was it? The hotel was built 2 years after I was dead. So it was really tough for me to run a stagecoach run 2 years after I was dead up to the Mount Washington. All right, a hotel, but up to Mount Washington. And so I ran there, and I also ran one to the Crawfords. Okay, so I pretty well provided transportation for people traveling to these areas out of Littleton. Now, my father, I have to talk a little bit about my family too. My father was William Brackett. He was born in Sudbury, Massachusetts. Don't tell anyone. He was a Flatlander. And he once asked, because when he came here, all right, he said, you know, they all knew he was from Sudbury. He was born 1799. And he says, well, will I ever be considered a native? Or, you know, and he said, no. He said, what about my children? And someone on Main Street said, just because the cat has kittens in the oven, don't make him biscuits. I'm not a biscuit. Now, anyway, my father was in mercantile. And I understand that his building is still up. It's still there. If you go on Main Street and you walk down the wooden sidewalks that we have, I think it's wonderful that the town fathers decided to put those in, because the dirt road gets muddy. And if you walk down, and there is a sharp turn that goes down to the grist mill. You familiar with the grist mill is? All right. Well, that's been there since 17. That was built when my father was born. And so anyway, it was Solomon Mann did it, but that kind of gets me going off on another gravestone. But right at the corner from Main Street and that street that goes down, there's a building that has large plate glass windows in it. Someone told me it's now a music place. And my father built that many, many years ago. Well, had to be many years ago. That was built by my father. My father decided to move back to Massachusetts. Well, that was his decision. I stayed here because I was born here. This was my home. My father had a home. We had a home on Meadow Street down here. And periodically when I can get out from under, I can look, and it doesn't look anything like it used to. I think there's another stage company down there. It's the Home Depot. And so it could be. And then there's a bunch of people from Scotland that have settled down there, the McDonald's. All right. So we lived there. My father decided he wanted to be more towards civilization, because that is the back end of town. So he built a house on Cottage Street, right by the railroad station. If you're familiar, when you go onto Cottage Street, all right, and if you're going this way and you take your right and you go across the covered bridge, before the bridge, if you look straight ahead of you, all right, there's a blacksmith shop, all right, and several houses. There are 3 houses there, and one is a blacksmith shop right on the corner. So if you take the right, you go across the covered bridge, and you head up. You go by the Lane house where the Lanes live. All right, he was a piano player, you know, and so you take the lane, you go up, and just before the railroad tracks, there's a house with a lovely veranda on the right that's set back. Well, my father built that. That people in town called it the Brackett House. Pardon? It is Brackett. Yeah. So that's my father built that, and that's where I spent a great deal of my childhood after we moved into civilization and from the outskirts down on Meadow Street. So that was one of the things. I did, as I told you, I sold my whole stage company in 1848. Sold it all. There was this new invention, the locomotive. Okay, and it was starting to catch on in places, and I knew it could only be a matter of time. And by glory, 1853, didn't one of those iron horses steam into Littleton? But I've got to tell you, all right, when they finished building the track, all right, it connected from Haverhill to Woodsville, and from Woodsville it went through Bath to Lisbon, and that's where they built from there to Littleton. And the name of the locomotive was the Reindeer. It didn't look like a reindeer, but they called it the Reindeer. And they had passengers. Well, you know what we did? Didn't trust that infernal machine that spewed out smoke and ash and fire. A stagecoach followed it because we knew that damn thing was going to break down. And those people would have to buy tickets to get into Littleton. Well, it made it. It arrived, but it did not arrive. The railroad station was not built in 1853. It actually stopped off at Mr. Eastman's home. Cyrus Eastman brought the railroad to the town of Littleton. And so it stopped actually at his home, which I guess is convenient to have a railroad stop in your front yard. All right. Now, I sold everything. I sold all my stage coach to a Mr. Cobley, who's buried right there. On the other side of that, it says Burnham on this side, Cobley's on the other. He's not forgiven me for it. We haven't talked since 1899. Okay? He's held it against me. I went into mining, and I think I told you about the gold mines. There were gold mines in Littleton, and the area, and iron. And I went into mining. Now, when I was younger, you see the way I'm dressed. When I was younger, I was never married. I was considered a dandy. All right? And because of my rugged good looks and my physique. After 115 years, I don't know what the physique looks like. But at least I've lost a lot of weight. But I was considered a dandy because I would dress up, and I was just the cat's meow. My nickname was Piper because I played the fife in the first town band. The first town band. And is the gazebo still on Main Street? It should be there on corner of Main Street and Jackson Street. We used to do concerts down there, and people would come in, and they loved it, and I just loved music. Just loved music. So that's what they called me, Piper. I was also called, I might have told you at the beginning, Major, okay? And because I wasn't in the military, but it was like the home guard. I never really did fight in any battles, unless you could find me a deadly fife and I could play someone to death. But that was about the extent of it. So that's what I did during my lifetime, 1816, 1899. And ever since 1899, things have been a little dull, except for like today. It isn't often that I have this many people come over, and I'm really quite glad to see so many people standing on Mr. Cobley. Take that, Mr. Cobley, your comeuppance. Thank you very much for coming. And remember, we have snacks over there, and also the wonderful Historical Society and Museum that keeps the history of my wonderful, beloved town alive. We run on donations. So if you have any loose change, please throw it into the basket. If you have any loose bills in the denominations of 10, 20, or 50, feel free to throw those in too. Thank you.
please step closer because I know my voice doesn't travel that far out. I know you're expecting to see Helen Bingham today, but Helen is not here today. I'm Catherine Bingham Walsh. And the reason Helen is not here today is because she would not be the type of person who would tell everything that she does for her town. She loved Littleton so much, but she was not a boastful person. She could not come and say, I did this and I did that. She would not be that kind of person, but I really want you to know her. And so I've come today to tell you about Helen. She was just so loved. And the best word to describe her was faithful. She was faithful to her friends, faithful to her town. She was faithful to her church, faithful to all the organizations that she was a part of. She was just so generous and loving. And so the actual Courier obituary said, one of God's most faithful persons. I want to tell you a little bit about the Bingham family. The Bingham house, if you know Littleton at all, is on School Street in Littleton. If you go up School Street, almost to the high school, not quite, there's a big blue Victorian home on the right-hand side, and that's the Bingham homestead. My father, Judge George Bingham, who sat actually on the New Hampshire Supreme Court, built the home in 1867, and Helen never left it. She stayed there. She never married. The only time she left, she did winter with me and my family in West Newton, Massachusetts. I married in 1898 Frederick Walsh, and he was a manufacturer in the town of Lowell. We lived in Lowell for a while, had 3 children, and moved to West Newton. And Helen, rather than stay in that great big house up here in Littleton, she would come to West Newton and help me with the 3 children. And I enjoyed her visit so much. For about 40 years she did that. The last 4 years of her life she spent right here year-round, right in Littleton. She opened up that house, that big house, to so many organizations and offered the space as a place to hold meetings. She offered it to the Red Cross, and during the war effort, the Red Cross worked on making quilts and sheets, shirts, they knitted socks, you name it. She opened up her house and her heart to the town. She was a wonderful person. She graduated from Smith College, and that was in 1894. I also graduated from there in 1895. So we were there partially together at the same time. We had 2 brothers. They were born about 10 years ahead of us girls. They were born in the 1860s, Andrew and George. My mother, Eliza, died at age 62 of cancer. But my father, George, actually was married before our mother. He was married to Louise Smith, who was from Linden, Vermont, and that woman passed away 4 years after their marriage. And then he married our mother, Eliza. But the Bingham family in Littleton was quite something. They began the Episcopal Church in Littleton. They were a big part of the Littleton High School beginnings. There's just an awful lot. The Friday Club, if you know about the Friday Club in Littleton, Mrs. Bingham, our mother, was huge in that, as well as Helen, too, as well. So she had a big heart, and I wanted to be here to tell you about her a little bit. I have pictures for you to look at. I have pictures of the house that's on South Street, and a picture of the stained glass window that the Bingham family donated to the Episcopal Church in honor of Helen. that's how much she meant to the family and to the town. And they wanted her to be remembered that way. But I'm glad you came today. I really wanted to share about her, how loved she was, and just what a wonderful person she was. And thank you so much for coming. Appreciate it.
Thank you.